All right, what I want to go over tonight is some basic refrigeration stuff. And I want to go over basic refrigeration stuff not so that we can talk about the refrigeration cycle in general, but what I want to talk about is what is normal in the refrigeration cycle. What is normal pressures? What is normal temperatures? And I wanted to talk about that because a lot of times when you start out in the trade, as you first start to learn to troubleshoot the refrigeration cycle, if you're having issues in the system or something like that, people will tell you, you know, the 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 suction pressure is high or the suction temperature is high, and oftentimes you don't know what that means. Okay, so when we start to do refrigeration cycle troubleshooting, I'll say we have low suction pressure, low superheat. What does that mean, right? What is low suction pressure? Um, so the only way to figure that out is to have a baseline of what is normal. So what we want to go over is what is normal, and we're going to do that a couple ways. First, we're going to go over this worksheet, and this worksheet is going to one, give you something to write down all the measurements you should be taking when you're trying to troubleshoot a refrigeration system, and it's going to tell you what is normal. So before we get into it, I do want to cover one other topic real quick, and then um, the difference between high temperature, medium temperature, and low temperature refrigeration. Because most of what we're going to go over is primarily oriented towards comfort cooling, high temp refrigeration. But we need to know what that means. The other thing, though, that's more important is when we're talking about pressures, I honestly don't care what the pressure is in the system. The reason is you have different refrigerants you're working with on any given day. And when the switch was made from R22 to R410A, a lot of people said, well, these are higher pressures and your pressures aren't going to look the same and it's going to be different. So you have to get used to what that is. And it really doesn't make sense to think about it like that because the pressure really doesn't matter. What matters is the saturated temperature of the refrigerant. So um, when I say the saturated temperature should be, what I'm talking about is the temperature in relation to the refrigerant as if it was a saturated vapor or a saturated liquid or whatever you want to call it. When that refrigerant is saturated, it's equally a liquid and a vapor. It's not superheated and it's not subcooled. And that's the temperature you're going to see on the dial of a set of mechanical gauges, or that's the temperature that you're going to see, usually the first temperature right below your refrigeration pressure, the temperature you're going to see on a set of digital gauges, and that temperature is way more important than what your actual pressure is. So I'll give you an example real quick. Let's um, let's switch over to a PT chart before we go any farther, and let's look at something. So a normal pressure, quote unquote, right, for R22 on your suction line is going to be somewhere around 70 degrees, right? A normal pressure, quote unquote, for an R410A system is going, or sorry, not 70 degrees, 70 psi. So normal suction pressure on R22, if everything's working pretty good and it's a standard day, is going to be somewhere around 70 psi. Normal pressure for a 410A system in the same conditions is probably going to be somewhere 110, maybe 120 psi, right? Well, if we look at a PT chart right here and we find R22 is this column and we find around 70 psi, we're talking 40 to 45 degrees is the saturated temperature of that refrigerant. If we look over right beside that, that is the same as about 118 psi on 410A. 410A systems tend to run slightly lower, um, in my experience, on the saturated temperature of the refrigerant, but not by much. We're talking about the difference between 35 and 40, 42 degrees here. So within 5 to 7 degrees of each other is normal. So if you get used to looking at it like that and you say switch to an R417A system, which isn't super common at all, at least I've never run into it. But if we're looking at that R417A system and we want to know, well, okay, what's the normal pressure I should be seeing on my suction line? You would go, okay, somewhere between 35, 40 degrees here. Once we go through this worksheet, it'll make a little bit more sense. But if we know we're kind of in this range, we're a little bit above freezing, probably right in the 40-degree range. We know that on the vapor pressure side, we should probably be looking at 56-ish psi. And that's not hard because we know what we're looking for as far as saturated temperatures. But if we're looking for normal pressures and we never worked on that kind of system before, we're going to be sitting there going, okay, well, what's normal for this system? Well, it doesn't really matter because if you're working on a comfort cooling system, all your temperatures are going to be very similar. It doesn't matter what refrigerant you're working with because we have to maintain the same temperatures in our evaporator to be able to cool the air enough to maintain the same temperatures in the house. And we're going to have the same temperatures outside to be able to give off heat to the outdoor air temperature. So if you focus on temperatures more than pressures, it'll make your life a whole lot easier. So generally, instead of saying, oh, my suction line pressure should be, I'll try and say, well, my saturated temperature of my refrigerant should be. And that's going to help you a lot when you're switching refrigerants. As we get new refrigerants down the road, you'll understand, okay, this is what I'm looking for as far as temps. Because if I don't have these temps, then everything else doesn't work. So, with that being said, let's take a global view at this worksheet for a second and get an idea of what we're going to be looking at. What we're going to be looking at is a basic cycle. We're going to see the whole cycle. We got a little pictorial diagram of it. And what this is this gives you places to write down, okay, what's my discharge pressure? Because if you have the ability to take that, you should take it because it could give you a good diagnostic tool if you're troubleshooting problems, say, in the condenser. What's my entering air temp of my condenser? And or your outdoor air temp, most likely if you're working on a split system where the air cooled condenser is outside, which is the most common scenario, right? um, what's my liquid line temperature? You got to know your liquid line temperature so that you know how much subcooling you have, assuming you have any subcooling. You can write down your subcooling once you know what that liquid line temperature is in conjunction with your liquid line pressure or your liquid line saturated temperature. You should know what the exiting air temp of your condenser is, the suction line pressure or the suction line saturated temperature, the entering air temp in your evaporator, so your return air temperature, the exiting air temp of your evaporator or your supply air temperature, the evaporator superheat, so how much superheat you've picked up in the refrigerant line through that evaporator, which once you have your suction line pressure or the saturated temperature of the refrigerant in the suction line and your evaporator line temperature, you can write that down. And all of these things will give you what you need to be able to properly troubleshoot a system. But the question is what of these are normal? So as we go through all these little points inside this diagram, understand that we're going to be talking about high temp, medium temp, and low temp systems. High temp is most of what we work with unless you're in refrigeration, particularly. So if you're working on walk-in coolers and retail stores, grocery stores, things like that, where you have cases and freezers and all those things, most of what we work with is high temp, which is generally above 45 degrees. So if the space is going to be above 45 degrees, that is high temperature refrigeration. Medium temperature refrigeration is basically your walk-ins and your reach-in coolers. That's 35 to 45 degrees. So that's stored fresh food temps. Um, I think flour cases, I forget if flour cases fall into medium temp or high temp, but they're, on the border there basically. And then low temperature is going to be your actual freezer. So something below 35 degrees, generally below 32. Even I think general freezer temps, and don't forgive me if I'm wrong, but you're closer to like 10 degrees, I think, because you want to make sure everything's frozen, but somewhere in that range basically. So I'm focusing on high temp here, but there are some notes on medium temperature refrigeration and low temperature refrigeration, so you get an idea on how that's different. But it's not very different in most scenarios. So, to start off, we'll start off at the compressor. The compressor is a vapor pump. It can only pump vapor. If we try and make it pump liquid, we're going to have problems, which is where we're going to end. But uh, if we're pumping vapor, we're going to pump out of the compressor, we're going to get a high pressure superheated vapor. So there should be no liquid refrigerant in what gets pumped out of the compressor. It should be high pressure with a high saturated temperature, and it should be very well superheated. A very good diagnostic tool, if you're able to take the discharge line temperature, is to check that line temperature, and it should not exceed 180 degrees. If you're above 180 degrees, odds are you have some other problem within the refrigeration circuit. You could be undercharged, you could have too much superheat because of very high load, um, any number of issues. It's just a good way to say, okay, is anything in general wrong? If you're above 180, you probably have a problem. Your absolute max is 225. If you're over 225, you definitely have a really large problem, because behind this line, this discharge line in the compressor, it is a much higher temperature than what you can read on the line exiting the compressor. So if you're at 225, the temperature inside that compressor might be 300 plus degrees. And at those temperatures, your refrigeration oil starts to break down. If your refrigeration oil in the compressor is breaking down, it's not properly lubricated, and you're certainly going to have problems with that compressor down the road. So, um, if you're in the 180 and up range, you probably have a problem. If you're over the 225 range, you should probably be expecting some kind of mechanical failure unless you can rectify the issue pretty quickly. Um, After that, we get a spot for your discharge pressure to write down in PSI. The discharge pressure, the only thing it really helps you determine is if you have an issue in the condenser, because your discharge pressure should be very close to your liquid pressure. So if your discharge pressure is very different from your liquid pressure, then you know you have some kind of restriction inside your condenser itself, because otherwise your discharge pressure should be close to it. Um, that's the only real reason to take discharge pressure. The other reason would be for some reason you can't get a liquid pressure. If you don't have a port to get the pressure on your liquid line, you can use the port that's on the discharge of the compressor. It should be the same. If it's not the same, you're going to be troubleshooting other problems in the system anyway. And it may help in some instances to add a port on the liquid line to help you determine, what kind of issue you have in the condenser. But we'll approach how to figure out those problems later. For now, just understand that's the main purpose of taking a discharge pressure, is either because you can't get liquid pressure or because you're trying to determine if you've got some kind of restriction in the condenser itself. As we enter the condenser, we want to look at a lot of measurements around the condenser, right? So our high temperature vapor is going to enter a condenser, and we have to give off heat. To give off heat, our discharge pressure had better be a saturated temperature that's well above outdoor air temperature. If it's not above outdoor air temperature, If we don't have a good superheated vapor that is above outdoor air temp, we're not going to be able to give off heat to the outside, which means we're not going to do a very good job of trying to pick up heat somewhere else because we haven't given any off to be able to pick it up. So, um, the best thing to do is look at, okay, what's my entering air temp? Your entering air temp ideally is 75 to 95 degrees because that's what most systems are designed to operate at. You get below about 65 and you're going to start running into issues that look like low evaporator load. You're going to have lower pressures than normal. You get below 50 to 55 and you need some kind of head pressure control to be able to operate in those kind of conditions because you can't let the condenser pressure drop that much because your evaporator pressure is going to drop. Um, but ideally, if you want all your measurements to look like the notes we have on this paper, you're going to be between 75 and 95 degrees. In general, if you're 65 to 100, things should look normal. You get above 100, 105, you're probably going to start getting dangerously close to tripping pressure switches, even on relatively good working systems. And you get below that, and you're going to start running into problems with pressures throughout the system. They're all going to be too low. Um, your exiting air temp should be the entering air temp plus 15 to 30 degrees. Why? Because you should be giving off heat to the air. So you take the entering air temp of your condenser, the exiting air temp, and that will tell you, okay, I'm giving off heat because I have a heat rise through it. The higher the efficiency system, the less that'll be. You might even see on a really high efficiency system only a 5 to 10 degree temperature rise. But in general, you're looking at somewhere around 20 degrees is what you look for. 15 to 30 is pretty good. If it's really high efficiency and that number's a little lower, don't be too worried about it. So right here, we have our group of liquid line readings that we should be taking. We have our liquid line pressure, our subcooling, and our liquid line temp. Once we have our liquid line pressure or saturated temperature of our liquid line and our liquid line temperature, the temperature of the actual refrigeration line, so the actual temperature of the refrigerant, we can figure out subcooling. So let's talk about liquid line pressure first. The liquid line pressure or the saturated temperature of the refrigerant in the liquid line should be air temperature plus 10 to 25 degrees or so. We're generally in the 13 SEER range nowadays. You might run into older system that's 10 or 12 SEER, but you're generally looking 10 to 25 degrees higher. So what's that mean? Let's do an example real quick, just so we understand. Say we're working on R410A and it is 80 degrees outside. We would expect the saturated temperature of that refrigerant to be somewhere around 100 degrees. So that's this line right here. This is R410A. This is 100 degrees Fahrenheit saturated pressure. So saturated temperature. So if we see about 317, maybe even 340 psi, that range, that's pretty normal. You can creep up a little bit. If it's a high efficiency system, you might be a little bit lower. But if we add 20 degrees from the outdoor air temperature, we want to try and get 10 degrees of subcooling, right? So unless we're 20, 30 degrees higher than the outdoor air temperature than we start, then we can't give off enough heat to reach that 10 degrees subcooling because once you get that 10 degrees subcooling, 9 times out of 10, uh, you're going to be 10 degrees hotter than it is outside. So if it's 80 degrees outside, I might expect to read somewhere around 90-degree line temperature. And that's going to be about 10 degrees cooler than my 100-degree saturated refrigerant temperature. Okay, so my pressure should be about 317. And then I would expect my line temp to be around 90 when I measure it with a thermometer if the outdoor air temperature is at 80. That would all be pretty close to what we're looking for. So going back, we can see that 10 to 25 degrees, 13 SEER, that's what we want our saturated temperature of our refrigerant to be above outdoor air temperature, or this number right here. So if we were to write 80 here, then we would expect this PSI to be somewhere around 317, and generally on a TXV you're going to have about 10 degrees subcooling in that case. All right. Um, so the liquid line temp, the biggest thing to keep in mind with that, other than using it to calculate subcooling, is that it should never be below the outside air temperature or the entering air temperature of your condenser. If at any time your line temperature is below your condenser entering air temperature, it's basically impossible unless you have some kind of restriction. There's no way that the air can cool that condenser lower than outdoor air temperature. The only exception to that is if the condenser is wet. So if it just rained and you're taking measurements and that condenser coil is still wet, or you just cleaned it and the condenser coil is still wet, then you can theoretically cool that refrigerant down to wet bulb temperature, which is going to generally be 12 to 15 degrees lower, depending on humidity outside, than the actual dry bulb temperature, right? Other than that, if the condenser is clean and dry and everything looks good, but your liquid line temp is lower than your outside air temperature, you must have a restriction somewhere, because you've got to be flashing refrigerant for that to happen. Your subcooling should generally be 5 to 15 degrees on a TXV. That's what most manufacturers are going to ask for. Bigger commercial systems, sometimes you'll see them ask if you actually, they'll have those charts on the outside of the unit that'll say, oh, at this outdoor temperature, your pressure should be this, and your line temperature should be this. You'll see some of those, if you actually calculate what those charts are showing you, that they want about 20 degrees of subcooling. So it's not outside of the ordinary for them to want more subcooling than 5 to 15, but especially residential and most of even your commercial systems, 5 to 15 degrees subcooling is generally sufficient to make sure that we're getting liquid refrigerant to our metering device. So that's what we're looking for on the condenser side. That's our whole condenser side already on what we're looking for as far as temperatures and as far as pressures. Um, After that, here I show a filter dryer. Um, Side note, I generally prefer my filter dryers to be right before my metering device, because half the role of the filter dryer is to make sure we don't clog up our metering device. The other half of its role is to try and grab any moisture that was left in the system from your evacuation, to absorb that so it's not circulating within the system causing acid in the oil or anything like that. It's a filter dryer. It's going to dry the refrigerant from any moisture left over that you couldn't evacuate, and it's going to filter any debris that you leave in the system if you didn't purge while you're brazing or something like that, or you happen to get a little bit of dirt in the line as you were putting it together. And hopefully we're talking about a very little bit of dirt. We're talking about dust particles and things like that. If it's full of dirt when you put it together, you're going to have problems even with the filter dryer, right? But in general, I prefer my filter dryers before the metering device. The only time I don't have my filter dryers before my metering device is if they're pre-installed with the equipment. But just like anything else, this is going to be a recurring theme. This is going to be a recurring theme throughout anything in the cycle. Your delta across a filter dryer or line set, or pretty much any passive component that's not supposed to be changing the pressure or temperature of this refrigerant, should not exceed 3 degrees. If I recall, let's see if we can figure it out by looking at a PT chart. If I recall correctly, well, we don't even have 3 degrees on here. but that difference is generally 3-ish psi for R22 and 6-ish psi for R410A. But it really doesn't matter because very rarely are you going to be using pressure ports to measure a pressure drop across it. Generally, the easiest thing to do is to put a thermometer on there and measure, okay, what's my temperature before my liquid line dryer? What is my temperature after my liquid line dryer? If that temperature before and after exceeds 3 degrees, it means we're starting to flash refrigerant through the liquid line dryer, which means it's restricted and needs to be replaced. Same thing for anything else. If my line set leaves my condenser and I have a 3/8 line set and it goes to my evaporator from inside to out, well, from outside to inside, if I measure the temperature where it enters the building and that line is 90 degrees, and then I get to that line right before it enters the evaporator and it's 87 or 86 degrees, then I know somewhere there's a restriction in that liquid line. There is a problem somewhere that we need to find and solve. Could be a kink in the line, could be a filter dryer or something clogged, could be any number of things, but generally it's going to be an actual something restricting the line. Could be full of brazing rod in a joint where somebody brazed a joint and just kept shoving brazing rod in that joint to make sure it didn't leak. But by making sure that it didn't leak, they got a lot of brazing rod inside the joint and that clogged the liquid line. That's what you're looking for. Anything more than a 3-degree difference from A to B is going to be uh, basically another metering device in the system, and we don't want that. We want one metering device so that we can expect what's going to happen as the refrigerant travels through the system. So once we hit your metering device, we're going to become a low pressure saturated vapor. After we've given off heat in the condenser, we want to take that subcooled liquid to our metering device, be it a piston or a TXV. We want to flash that to a saturated vapor, so basically an equal mixture of vapor particles and liquid particles. Going back to our first lesson on thinking mechanically, basically we want to mist that refrigerant through a mister as if it's water so that it can pick up heat very quickly. Um, so as we become a low pressure saturated vapor, we're going to run into the evaporator to try and pick up heat. Well, there's all kinds of temperatures we want to maintain here. Once we get past that metering device, our suction line pressure should be generally 30 to 44 degrees for high temp, 34 to 44 degrees for high temp, 20 to 30 degrees for medium temp, -10 to -15 degrees for low temp. Talking about high temp or comfort cooling specifically. If we are trying to maintain probably about a 55-degree exiting air temperature, if it's 75 degrees inside, and we're looking for about a 20-degree delta T, which is generally what we're looking for across our evaporator. The entering air temp of the evaporator, if it's 75 degrees, we should have 55 degrees exiting the evaporator. If that's what we're trying to do, then our refrigerant has to be even cooler, has to have less heat than the air going across it to achieve that. And it has to be lower than what we want to achieve at the end because, again, unless it's a very high efficiency evaporator, a very large coil, there's no way 55-degree refrigerant is going to bring that air down to 55 degrees. So we need it to be even cooler so we have plenty of heat to pick up. All right. So generally, your suction line pressure or your suction line saturated temperature should be 34 to 44 degrees. It's going to be approximately 25 to 35 degrees below space temp. So say somebody's trying to keep it 65 degrees inside. If they're trying to keep it 65 degrees inside, we're going to be 35 degrees below space temp possibly. So we could actually be below freezing, which is not a very good thing for high temp. Generally, you're not going to actually hit that but it's still possible, which is why we're designed to maintain 70 to 75 degrees. 75 degrees is the design temp. If we were 35 degrees below 70 degrees, we would be 75 degrees. It would be at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. 40 degrees is about in our range. Um, if we were trying to maintain 70, you know, if we're 35 degrees below that, our line temperature is going to be, or our saturated temperature is going to be 35 degrees, which is a common number you see in a 410A system, which is fine. But it should never be below 32 degrees for high temp. Why? Well, if the line temperature or the saturated temperature of the refrigerant is below 32 degrees, the line temp gets below 32 degrees, what starts to happen? We're below 32 degrees in this evaporator, and any water droplets that are in the air, which there's always some amount in the air, right, are going to start to freeze. Those start to freeze, and high temperature systems don't have any way to thaw that evaporator. With medium temp and low temp systems, we have defrost cycles to to thaw those. Like in a heat pump in the winter, we have a defrost cycle because we know it's going to be running below freezing outside because that's a very cold evaporator trying to pick up heat, right? Um, but if we're running in air conditioning, there's no defrost cycle. So if it starts to freeze, it's going to snowball. As it starts to freeze, the ice starts to build up, starts to clog the evaporator, makes the evaporator pick up less heat, starts to freeze some more, and it's a vicious cycle. It's how we end up with low suction pressure and low superheat. So, um, it should never be below 32 degrees for high temp. You generally want to figure out how to make normal operating above 32. If I have a system that's pretty low on charge, one of the first things I do is get it above freezing. Once it's above freezing and we know the evaporator isn't frozen, everything looks good, we can adjust our charge from there. But first thing you do is get it above freezing. So, suction line pressure should be 35 to 44 degrees for high temp, or about 25 to 35 degrees below space temp. So if you have a space temp that's not within 70 to 75, then you're going to have a saturated temperature that's different than this. But this is generally what you're shooting for. Again, entering air temp should be design temperature, should be ideally 75 degrees. Some people may keep it a little cooler, some people may keep it a little bit warmer, but it should be close to the airspace in the house or in the room or the unit or whatever it is. If it's way out of whack, right? If you're getting 100-degree entering air temp, you need to look at, okay, why is my entering air temperature that high? It could be a return line in an attic that's not sealed very well, so it's picking up air from the attic. Um, it could be air bypassing from some other system getting in there. Could be any number of reasons, but your entering air temp should generally be the design air temperature of the system if everything's operating normally. The exiting air temp is going to be um, space temp minus 17 to 22 degrees for comfort. So again, we say 20-degree delta T is normal. Really, when we get into designing systems, we'll find out that 17 to 21 degrees is normal. It used to be that they said 18 to 22 degrees is normal. So we just expand that and say, okay, anything between 17 to 22 is pretty close. Ideally, it's a 20 degree delta. It could be a little bit outside of that, though, for whatever reason. It could be an older system, just doesn't work as well anymore, but it's still working in a reasonably well. So it might have a slightly lower delta. You know, we might only drop 17 or 18 degrees across it. Could be fan speeds wrong, or could be that we're in an environment that has very low humidity and we want a lower delta T. We want more airflow across the evaporator. So in general, 17 to 22 is good for comfort. space temp -4 to 8 degrees for medium and low temp. So it's going to be a slightly closer to air temperature situation when you're talking about walk-in coolers and reach-ins and things like that, or your refrigerators in your house. Um, Generally smaller spaces, so you're generally going to end up a little closer to that space temperature in the evaporator. But 17 to 22 degrees for comfort cooling is what we're looking at. Then we get to superheat. You have to take and there's no spot for it on here. Maybe that's something I'll add um, before I give you guys this handout, because I will post this handout so that you can have a look at it. Um, but there's no spot for line temperature. But basically, the only reason to take your line temperature is A, to see if there's more than a 3-degree difference between A and B. If you pick up a little bit of heat in the suction line, it's not that big of a deal. But generally, it should be insulated and you shouldn't be picking up that much. But if you're dropping temperature or something like that, or you've got a really big temperature difference between the evaporator and the outdoor unit, then you could have a restriction in your suction line. But other than that, the only reason you take the suction line temperature is so that you can get evaporator superheat. Evaporator superheat should should generally be 8 to 12 degrees for comfort cooling. Obviously, that changes a lot with a piston or capillary tube, any type of fixed orifice. Any type of fixed orifice, and you could end up with a very different um, line temperature, superheat, right? Because as the outdoor conditions change, it's going to change the amount of liquid refrigerant that enters your orifice, which is going to change how the evaporator performs. But even then, if you're at design conditions and you've got a fixed orifice, you should have 8 to 12 degrees roughly of evaporator superheat. But if you are dealing with a fixed orifice, we'll look at a chart for that, and you'll get a generic chart that you can use to determine, okay, what is the proper superheat based on the temperatures that you're actually dealing with inside and outside, and your wet bulb temperature and all that. But normal with a TXV leaving the evaporator is 8 to 12 degrees for comfort cooling, 6 to 8 degrees for medium temp, 4 to 6 degrees for low temp. So if you're working on those walk-ins or you're working on those freezers, then that's what you're generally going to see as far as setting that. And if you're setting an adjustable TXV, right there, 8 to 12 degrees is where I like to be. I like to kind of be at 10 to 12 myself, but anywhere 8 to 12 is acceptable. If you're below 8 or above 12, you might want to look at what might be the issue. But even this isn't necessarily your most important number, even though superheat's basically as important as it gets. Um, just making sure we covered everything up to here. The last thing you're going to check is total superheat. Total superheat is everything once you get to the compressor. Total superheat measured 6 to 12 inches from the compressor should be about 20 to 30 degrees. It might be 10 to 20 on high efficiency systems, but if you measure the line temperature from 6 to 12 inches from the compressor, you should generally have 20-ish degrees of superheat. If you don't have that, then you need to start looking for any issues in the system. You must always have some superheat. And here is my lecture on that. We get in a bad habit, I think, of so many systems having TXVs these days that a lot of people look at subcooling as the most important number. Because if you have 10 degrees of subcooling, then you have a proper charge and everything should be working normally, right? But do you know the TXV is working right? Is it doing its job? If you don't have superheat, you can damage the compressor. If you don't have subcooling, the system might not perform that well. You might have a little bit too much heat back to the compressor, which isn't good for the compressor either. But if you're maintaining a discharge line temperature below 180, then it's not a huge concern, right? You're just not, the system's not performing to its maximum capacity if you don't have proper subcooling to a TXV. If you don't have proper superheat on the TXV, you're going to likely damage the most expensive component in the system, essentially. A compressor is generally one of your most expensive components to replace, and anytime you have to replace a compressor because of issues in the system, you might have other issues you now have to deal with. If it was a burnout, you're going to have to clean up the system, put in suction line dryers, clean everything up, do a flush. You might have to take the TXV out to get that done. If it's a mechanical failure, you might end up with metal shavings in the system that now you have to deal with, and you have to make sure don't clog up your filter dryers. There are so many issues that come with a failed compressor that superheat will always be your most important number. Its total superheat should be about 20 degrees. Evaporator superheat should be 8 to 12. If that superheat is too high, we're not going to properly cool the compressor because the compressor is cooled by the refrigerant coming back to it. If that superheat is too low, we're going to get liquid to the compressor. It's going to start slugging and we're going to cause mechanical damage. Either way is bad. So if you're hooking up your gauges and you're constantly looking for subcooling, I want you to instead always look at superheat first. I don't care what kind of system you're working on. Look at superheat first, then check your subcooling, see if your charge is right. Then look at superheat again and make sure that looks right based on having a proper charge. If the superheat is too low, but you have a proper charge, you may have a failed TXV. You may have a TXV that's just not operating normally. I've seen it on new systems. I've seen TXVs, brand new systems. I'm running 3, 4 degrees of superheat on a relatively long line set, and it's just basically a bunk TXV out of the box. It should not be maintaining 3 degrees of superheat. So if that's what you've got, all it takes is for those pressures to drop a little bit for you to have almost zero superheat the next day, and now you've got a major issue in the system. So superheat's always the most important. The next most important is probably this discharge line temperature so you don't eat up the oil. And then after that, everything else is just, is it functioning properly? So, a good thing to do would be uh, look at these, look at this worksheet and ask yourself, okay, if it's say it was a really hot day, but it's going to be a really cool night. We get those days with large swings, right? So somebody calls and says, "Hey, my air conditioner's not working," and you don't get out to that call till late. So you get to that call pretty late, and the temperature has dropped throughout the day, but the building is still warm. So it could be 80, 90 degrees inside the building and 60 degrees outside. What's normal gonna be? Is normal gonna be 70 psi on an R22 system? I don't think so because you're gonna have 80 to 90 degree entering air on your evaporator. Is normal gonna be, you know, uh, um, what? What's 100 degrees? 317, about 317 or whatever it was psi on a 410A system? I don't think so. If it's running, then it's probably going to have a pretty low head pressure because it's cool outside. So even though they're trying to run cooling, it's cooler outside than it is inside. And all those pressures are going to be completely different than what, guys that just look at it and say, oh, you get used to it, say what normal is. And a lot of times that's when your undercharges and your overcharges happen because guys see pressures out of whack and aren't able to determine what their pressures should be. This, if you take a good look at it and get used to using it and get used to taking these temperatures and pressures and thinking about your pressures as saturated temperatures instead of pressures, so you're constantly looking at what is this temperature in relation to that temperature in relation to that temperature. If you get used to doing that, you'll be 10 steps ahead on the troubleshooting process, and it'll be a lot easier to determine what's going on, whether everything's normal, whether you have a line restriction, whether you have an air restriction, whatever the case may be. So over the next couple classes, we're going to go over troubleshooting all the individual situations. You know, when we have high suction pressure with a high superheat, what's that mean? Low suction pressure, low superheat, what's that mean? We're going to drill those things in and talk about them. But the most important thing is to say, okay, well, what does low mean? What does high mean? Well, this is what low and this is what high is in relation to. If you have any questions on this, let me know. I will put this worksheet up for you guys to be able to use, whether it be for troubleshooting or just for practice. And then we'll do probably a short quiz on finding the proper pressures, finding the proper temperatures based on, outdoor temperature or whatever. And we'll see how well you get the information. And then we'll work from there. And then we'll talk about refrigeration troubleshooting in general. As always, you got questions, let me know. Otherwise, that's the lesson.